Have you ever looked at a sim and been amazed by the sheer level of aggression that the solver shows in some spots? Well, if you've been studying these spots and been curious about what these strategies are and why they exist, then this video is for you. Hi Wizards, today we're going to be talking about the 3 most aggressive GTO strategies. So to break down this topic in a little bit more depth, let's talk about the 3 strategies that we're going to be outlining in this video. First of all, we're going to be talking about the out of position flop jam. So spots where we get to the flop out of position and we just jam all in immediately on the flop. Then we're going to be talking about the geometric flop sizing. So a 3E geometric size where we're overbetting the flop quite significantly and we're looking to get stacks in across 3 streets. And then we've got what we might call the river power jam, where we are jamming the river for multiple times the pot, sometimes into a very small pot. So we'll talk about those 3 different strategies over the course of this video. And to dive into the first one, let's talk about the out of position flop jam. This strategy is mostly going to be used in 3-bet pots, and it's going to be in spots where the caller has a lot of medium strength drawing hands. So that's going to be mostly a lot of Jack 10x flush draw flops, and sometimes some of the flops with 3 to a wheel, so 5, 4, 3, something like that. It's generally going to be boards where our very vulnerable overpairs want to get as much money in the pot as possible right now before the board gets a lot worse. And so we have a huge incentive to just be all in, put our opponent in a tough spot when they have a lot of those tricky drawing hands, like, for example, the Jack 10x. They're going to have a lot of King Queen, which has a lot of awkward spots against a massive flop jam. So let's look at an example of a spot like that right now. So here's our example. We're going to be looking at a chip EV tournament spot, 100 big blind ranges, button against small blind. So the button opens, the small blind 3-bets, and the button calls. This is the button's calling range, as you can see here. A lot of suited hands, a lot of pairs. And the small blind has a fairly mixed 3-bet range, but hands like 10s plus are going to be basically pure 3-bet in this formation, alongside a lot of other suited hands and pairs for board coverage. So we're going to go with this situation. We're going to hit create solution. And you can see right away that the 3.6x pot jam on the flop is the best strategy on this Jack 10-8 flush draw flop. Now let's take a look at how we're actually constructing this range. It's not quite constructed in the way that you might think. It's very natural to think that maybe the construction here might be a lot of very strong hands like sets and things like that. But in fact, the very top of our range here is doing quite a lot of checking. If I highlight best hands right here, you can see that outside of pocket queens, which has a strong incentive to just jam and get some value there, a lot of our other strongest hands are doing a lot of checking. We're really trapping most of the time here with all of our sets and a lot of our straights as well, with the slight exception of some of the straights that don't have either of the flush draws here. So we're actually checking the very, very top of our range. And if you look at the very bottom of our range, we're also checking all of our weakest hands. We're checking a lot of the stuff that just has no real equity at all here, especially stuff like ace-5 off. So if we're checking the top and the bottom, does that mean we're shoving the middle? Well, it actually does, because if we look at our good hands and our weak hands, the bulk of our shoving range is coming from these hands. In fact, it's really coming from a lot of these good hands. It's coming from a lot of the hands that have pretty strong equity, but stand to get a lot worse across 3 streets in a lot of situations. We've got everything from our 2 pairs, like our Jack 10s and our 10-8 suiteds here, which are jamming for value and protection, all the way to some hands like aces and kings, although a little bit less of the aces because they need a little bit less protection. Then we've got our pocket queens, as we already saw. We've got a lot of Jack X, and we've also got a surprising amount of some medium to strong draws. We've got some ace-queen offsuit, and we've even got hands like 10-9 suited with a pair plus a open-ender there, a little bit of weak top pair like Jack 7, and some 2-pair with the Jack 8 as well right there, and some surprising stuff like Queen 10 in there. So it's a little bit of a weird construction here. And if we want to figure out why this is what it is, well, we have to take a look at the response that our opponent's going to have. If we look at what they're doing against the jam, you can see quite clearly what the region of hands is that we're targeting here. It's this weak hands region. We're putting them in tough spots with all of these medium to strong hands. And there's a lot of very counterintuitive things going on when they face this massive jam. Take a look at some of the hands that are actually calling and folding here. You might want to pause the video and take a moment to make some observations here about some of the things that are a little bit unexpected. If we take a look at the draws, well, first of all, our opponent actually has to fold some hands like 7-6 and 7-5 of spades here. They have a combo draw, but they have to fold it because they're getting such a bad price. And this is very good for us. If we look at the nut flush draw, of course they're not folding that. But a lot of their other flush draws actually have to fold as well. We're putting them in a very tough spot with hands like king high flush draws. We're putting them in a tough spot with the weaker flush draws. All of these hands have to fold. And on top of that, a lot of their open-enders have to fold as well. Their ace queens, their king queens, all of this stuff is in a rough spot. Ace 9 and king 9 also in a rough spot. And even pocket 9s here is very mixed between call and fold. 9-6 suited mixed between call and fold. 9-6 suited just purely folding right there. So ultimately, they have tons of draws which have really awkward spots against this jam. They also have a lot of gut shots. They have a lot of 7x, which are going to have very difficult continues. They're going to have to fold. They have a certain tiny amount of ace-king even in there. They have queen 10, which has pretty good equity, but is not in great shape against this jamming range. So there's just a ton of hands which have a really awkward decision. If we look at the range distribution here, you can see it's 45% weak hands in our opponent's range. Everything in this area is going to really have a tough spot against our jam here. And in particular, the fact that we have all of these good hands. 81% of our range is good hands, like we just identified. So many of those hands have that ability to jam here and just put these weak hands in a lot of very tough spots. So in terms of construction, if we go back to our range, we're very much checking the very top at a high rate. We're checking the very bottom, basically always. And then we are shoving a lot of the middle strength good hands that we have in this category. And that is really important as far as the strategy goes. Now, just for some clarity here, I did show you this node where we have already shoved, and we saw that 81% of our hands are good hands here after we shove. It's important to note that that's not necessarily the starting point for this spot on the flop. We do only have 56% good hands on the flop. But of course, when I show you this node right here, we're looking at the equity of these hands at this very specific point in the tree. So that's a slight distinction there that is noteworthy. But generally speaking, as you can see, there's a ton of merit to this big flop jam. And this strategy can be viable all the way up to about 4 times the pot in a lot of cases. Depending on the exact nature of the ranges, you will see 4x being pretty much the top end, 3x pot, 2x pot, a lot more viable in a lot of these cases. But there are some very big flop jams in a lot of these spots, and Jack 10x is really the best kind of flop that is applicable for this approach. So really interesting strategy we're seeing here, and obviously very, very aggressive. So our next aggressive strategy here is the Flop Overbet. Now this is generally going to hinge on the idea of geometric sizing. If you're not sure what geometric sizing is, it basically refers to using a bet size that is designed so that we can get all in across all the remaining streets by using the same size each street. And what that does is force our opponent to bluff catch multiple streets at the highest frequency, which maximizes the EV of the top of our range. So quite often here, on certain specific board textures where the pre-flop raiser has a big nut advantage, we're going to see this overbet come in, such as on boards like Ace-King X, or some low card, disconnected rainbow flops like a 10-7-4. Now the sizing can go as big as about 2x the pot here sometimes, although it's quite rare that it goes bigger than that. You will find some spots, but 3x pot or so is going to be very rare. It's designed to allow us to immediately polarize our range on the flop and force our opponent into basically playing a bluff catching strategy for all 3 streets. Doesn't really allow them to raise the flop very much at all, and it really puts a lot of their bluff catchers on the back foot and allows us to maximize that EV from the value portion of our polarized range. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of this. So we're going to go with MTT ranges once again here, although the same principles are going to be just as applicable in cash game scenarios. I've gone with 100 big blinds hijack against big blind just for a kind of average situation. And I'm going to switch to the table view here just because it's a little easier to see what we're looking at. You can see we've got 4 flop sizes in this report. We've got 1/3, 2/3, full pot, and 1.5x pot. Now, if I was to filter for the flops that use the 1.5x pot at the highest frequency, you can immediately see that there's quite a lot of these low card disconnected boards like I mentioned right here. 8 high, 9 high with some straight draws, but no actual flop straights. And we've also got the ace king 3 in there, the ace king 4, ace king deuce, and so on. And if we look at how the ranges are constructed here, we'll see a couple of different examples for the 9-5 deuce, and then we'll also look at the ace king 3. So with the 9-5 deuce, this is what it looks like. And this 1.5x pot overbet, which is approximately a geometric size for this spot, is being used at a very high frequency. You can see that in this spot, the hands that are relying on this size to get the max value are basically going to be the overpairs. All of these overpairs are so strong here. They all have really high equity, and they also need a little bit of protection. So we're really shoveling in some big bets here with these hands and just maximizing the amount of value that we can get right now. And our betting range is also going to be quite polarized because we've got quite a few hands at the bottom end that are very weak. We've got some queen highs and jack highs and 10 highs. We've got some 7-6 for the low gut shot. And of course, we've also got a subsection of bluffs coming in that are just broadways with backdoors, or even some other ace high, king high, queen high, jack high, and a few of our lower straight draws once again creeping in there. So ultimately, it's a pretty polarized range. A lot of the hands that you might expect to be betting at high frequencies here would be draws, but of course, there's only a few draws available on this board, and there's a lot of these draws that aren't really in a great spot if they get check raised. So something like 8-7 is mixing bets here, but it's not really going with a super high frequency. By contrast, hands like Jack 10, especially with a backdoor, very, very high frequency bet, if not pure bet here. So ultimately, we're going with a very polar range, and we're going with a huge size in this flop to really apply max pressure to all those bluff catchers. And look at what happens if we go with this 1.5x pot. Our opponent is now forced into indifference with a lot of their 5x hands. There's a lot of second pair that has to mix calls and folds there. And of course, they're also folding a big chunk of their pocket pairs, as well as a lot of their ace highs. And it becomes quite complex for them with hands like ace 4 and ace 3, as well as some of their stronger ace highs like ace jack and ace 10, because those hands are right on the borderline between various different options. And in general, this overbet size is really applying a lot of pressure and putting them in a lot of tough spots. We're also forcing them to fold some of their gut shots right here as well, which is very helpful for that value portion of our range. So 9-5 deuce, very effective kind of a spot for this really big bet strategy. If we now flip it to the ace king 3, and we take a look at the strategy for this board, we can see a similar dynamic emerging. We've got that very big size being the only size that's really used here. In this case, it's 1.5x pot, but some spots it can go as big as 2x pot, and you can see it's going to be very polarized. The range that's betting here is going to be a lot of these best hands. You can see ace 9 plus is really the value region, everything kind of up here with pocket aces checking because it blocks too much of the top pair. Then you've also got a little bit of some draws that are bluffing in there, the queen jack and the queen 10. Tiny bit of king x, which is actually kind of turning itself into a bluff, folding out some better king x. It's a little bit of a weird strategy there. 7, 6s, and 5s also bluffing here. And then we've got a lot of the weak and the trash hands as the bluffs. And you can see we're really mixing in everything from the weaker straight draw in the jack 10 here, all the way through to some queen high, jack high, 10 high, really just kind of mixing bets with basically everything that isn't particularly strong here. There's not really any obvious bluff candidates here except for the straight draws. Everything else is just kind of mixing between bets and checks because we want to have board coverage in that bluffing range, and we also want to just maximize the frequency that we're able to fire out some bluffs there to balance out that value. So in the end, this really aggressive strategy is putting our opponent right on the back foot, and you can see that there are very few raises that are possible here. Only about 3% raise frequency, and it's basically pocket 3s, king 3, little bit of ace-3, a little bit of ace-queen. Kind of have to bluff with stuff like 5-4 here. Definitely some pretty tricky bluffing candidates to find. And you can see how much folding they're having to do. In fact, they're even having to fold some of their good hands. They're having to fold a lot of King X, including even some of the King X here that doesn't have a backdoor. So they're really going to be put under a lot of pressure, and even a lot of their Ace X. If we look at the actual EV of continuing here with, let's say, their top pair category, if we go strategy, we go EV, even something like Ace-7 for top pair is basically exactly break even right away on the flop. That's what this large sizing is serving to do. It's taking a hand as strong as top pair, and it's immediately making it into a break-even bluff catcher on the flop by betting so big and with such a polar range that the Ace-7 is now no longer beating any value. They basically are bluff catching immediately on the flop instead of being in a position where they actually beat some value hands. And this, of course, is very, very valuable in a spot where we have all the Ace-King and our opponent really doesn't have any. So very good, very reasonable strategy here, and a nice way to look at these types of Ace-King X boards as being boards that are really, really good for flop overbets. So that's our second of the 3 most aggressive GTO strategies. And our final strategy here is what we're calling the river power jam. And these are kind of rare spots, but they do come up from time to time. It's going to be a spot where the river SPR is still fairly high, but one player, in this case our opponent, is going to possess a somewhat capped range. They don't have very many strong hands. This allows the other player, which is us in this case, to go for maximum value with their strong hands, which sometimes involves jamming for many times the pot size. And even something like 10 times the pot can be used occasionally here. And I have found an example of that for you guys, so let's take a look. So this is our spot here. It's going to be a 10-8-4 rainbow flop. Again, MTT ranges, just to make it simple. Keep the ranges a bit wider with some antes out there. We've got 60 big blind stacks. Hijack opens, big blind calls, 10-8-4 rainbow. Flop is going to go check-check, which is not going to happen that often here, but it is going to happen sometimes. In position is going to be able to go with a fairly big bet size, but they are able to check about 8% of their range, so it's not a high frequency, but it does happen. And the turn is going to be a deuce of clubs, so we're going to go check-check and then turn pretty much a blank here. As the out of position player, we're going to be taking a bet 75 or check strategy, and we're betting 75, reasonable frequency, but we're not going to bet in this case. It's going to go check-check again. So villain's going to check back the turn, which they're actually doing quite often here. Again, fairly narrow range. It's only 17 combos or so, but it is a non-zero frequency, and it is something that is going to happen from time to time. And then the river's another deuce. And what this does is creates a scenario where, because any deuce is now an extremely strong hand, and we're the only player who realistically can have a deuce at any significant frequency, it now allows us to have a very unusual strategy here on this river. Take a look at what it looks like. We've got some blocker bets in there for just over 1 big blind. We've got some large bets. We've got some over bets for about 10 big blinds into a pot of 6 or so, almost 2 times the pot. And then we've got this massive 10 times the pot all in here, which, even though it's only 10% of our range, that's 40 combos of hands. And that's not an insignificant portion of the overall deck here. It is a reasonable frequency that something like this is going to come up, or that a spot like this can come up. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to really get into the habit of using these massive 10x pot jams, but it is useful to have it in your arsenal, because it is a valuable way to really apply pressure in these spots with an extremely polar range. And if we look at what that range actually looks like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color scheme here just to make it a little bit easier to actually interpret and see. We've got the dark purple there, which is the all-in, and you can kind of see where it's coming from. You can kind of see that the range is going to be a lot of deuce X, a lot of stuff down here, which is really looking to play a big pot. And then we've got a wide variety of bluffs, honestly. And we've also got a weird frequency of 10x coming in here. So maybe we're actually going for value with that stuff. Let's take a look. The region that's indifferent against this range is essentially everything our opponent has. There's almost nothing here that has an always call scenario. There's nothing here that's playing pure call. They're just forced to essentially play a low frequency bluff catch with a lot of their 8x, which is pretty much the top of what they're going to have left in their range. And they just have nothing else to call with. They have no nut hands here whatsoever, right? And this is why it's actually allowing us to play this strategy here. We're forcing them to bluff catch for an absolutely massive bet with an 8. If they don't do this, we would just bluff everything in our range for this size. And the reason they're actually calling with an 8 is, of course, because we're finding the right amount of bluffs. But that also allows us to actually value bet with a 10. So you can see that Queen 10, Jack 10, it's not bluffing to try to get a better 10 to fold. It's value betting to get a worse 10 to call. Ace 10, King 10, same thing. So if we look at the overall construction of the range, from the trash hands, it looks like the bluffs that we're picking for the all-in are going to be a lot of the queen highs and king highs that really need to get ace high to fold, so they can't easily bluff for a small size. And they're also going to have a little bit of blocking power against the top pair, the queen 10 or something that might have checked back, queen 8, stuff like that. And then there's going to be some tiny shreds of like jack high, 9 high. Not really any specific category of hand that's favoring this massive size as a bluff. You can see that a lot of the weakest bluffs in our range, the 9 high, 7 high, they're kind of favoring the smaller size, which is something that happens quite a lot because they're really they only need to get queen high and king high to fold in order to be getting a good outcome here. So the hands that have a little tiny bit of showdown value, like the queen highs and the king highs, we're bluffing really, really big with them. And then we're bluffing 2x pot, which is comparatively small in this case, with the 9 highs, the 7 highs, the 6 highs. And we do have that block bet in there as well with a lot of our 4x hands, which is just trying to get a little bit of tiny thin value from ace high. But ultimately, this big bet is a pretty decent part of our strategy. Let's take a look at how our EV evolves if we eliminate this big bet. Our EV here on this river is 2.37 big blinds. And if we get rid of the all-in strategy, let's see how it affects our EV. It's going to reduce it to 2.33. So that doesn't seem like that much, 0.04 big blinds, but that's 4 big blinds per 100 hands. And really the only difference there is understanding that the top of our range has a huge incentive to get max value, and squeezing an extra 4 big blinds per 100 out of this scenario, definitely there's a lot to be said for that in terms of how much it contributes to our overall win rate. So I do think it's worthwhile to study these spots. Obviously, 10x pot is a very extreme example, but if you think about the spots where it's 3x pot, 4x pot, 5x pot, the influence on our EV there is going to be quite significant compared to, let's say, just going with a very standardized strategy of check or bet 75. If I compare the EV of that strategy here, if we go bet 75 and check, probably going to be reasonably substantial EV loss here. Let's take a look. Yeah, we're now down to 2.24. So by going with a simplified strategy of check or bet 75 on this river, compared to the more complex strategy that involves some massive power jams, we've gained about 13 big blinds per 100 by going with the strategy that has some power jams. And clearly that's complicated, but it's also worthwhile. So I definitely encourage you to study these spots if you get the opportunity. So that's going to be about it for this video. Hopefully you learned a lot about the most aggressive GTO strategies that are out there in the solver and why some of those exist. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about some GTO concepts, take a look at this recent video that I made here about why Ace 5 suited is known as the solver hand. Until next time, guys, good luck everyone, and I'll be back again soon with another video.